Hey guys, good morning. Welcome back again. We have 5 minutes till 9 a.m., so I'm just gonna be here with the stream. And if you're already here, thanks a lot for your attendance this morning, and I'll just be starting in a few. Hi, Stephen. How's it going? Good to see you. And hello. Hey, Ryan. Welcome back. I'm doing pretty good. I'm glad it's Friday. I know Chapman, I guess, doesn't celebrate President's Day, but some of the other places that I do also teach have the day off, so it's going to be at least a bit of a long weekend, a lighter Monday. So I'm looking forward to that. Good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Looks like it rained a little bit overnight over here in Long Beach. Hope the sun comes out a little bit later on. Yeah, we do have class on Monday. Don't all your classes meet on Monday? If you have, or do you only have my class on Monday? It's not a school holiday for Chapman University, no. But I wonder, do you have other professors that are just electing to not hold class on their own? That would be interesting to know if they're doing it. Maybe someday I will, but I'm not going to do it in this semester at all. Because the schedule's already set. But maybe you can let me know. Wait, Stephen, what are you saying the word no to? In response to the question whether other professors are holding class, okay? Oh yeah, okay, good, yeah. Right, yeah, I know. Okay, correct. And we just have another 2 minutes until we're getting to 9 a.m. Welcome back, everyone. Hi, Alex, Connor, Brian, Sloan, Drew, Dimitri, I see you guys. Cool. Hey there, Elif. Amanda, good to see you too. Just another minute. Hey, Noah. Hi there, Kylie, Marin. Abby, Nicole. Good morning. Is it not good? Like, good morning? It's been pretty good. Oh, yeah, okay. Hi, Nina. Looks like blue isn't it right now in terms of the markers. But anyway, guys, hey, welcome back, everyone. Nice to see you. So let's get started. It's 9 a.m. Pretty much today what we're going to do is wrap up the last remaining notes in the William Paley article on the argument from design. And then we're going to try to continue through the syllabus. We have a couple of short pieces after that to go through. One is by Ernest Nagel, and we'll see if we can get to Blaise Pascal from there. Okay, so let's just jump right back to the last lecture's author. This is William Paley. And as we learned, he lived from 1743 to 1805, and in 1804 he wrote this book that contains the argument from design. Okay, the argument from design by Paley, 1804. Another argument which seeks to prove the existence of God. So in his presentation, he starts off with the example of a person walking through the woods and just finding a watch. And the takeaway point that he wants you to kind of, think of a common sense basic agreement on is that if you saw something like a watch, you know that it had to have some kind of intelligent being, in this case a human, but at the very least there had to be some intelligent maker, some kind of watchmaker when there's a watch. Because a watch can't happen randomly, through chance, through luck. Why not? Well, how could a thing that tells time, with all the little gears and parts pieced together, possibly happen through chance? It had to be done through an intended act, an intentional act of creation to establish a timepiece. It is because it has a function, a purpose, and all of these complex inner workings that allow it to perform the purpose, which makes it pretty clear he thinks that it had to have a maker. Okay, so the principle then mentioned is that if there is something with a purpose or function or this kind of complex assembly of parts, then it had to have an intelligent creator. Now, after that point, that's just a quick beginning of the argument that we talked about last time. He next mentions some factors that would not cause somebody to doubt that the watch has a maker. Okay, so that's in a way slightly confusing the way it's worded because it's like a double negation, but these are factors that would not cause a person to not think that the watch has a maker. So it would never cause you to doubt that the watch has a maker. These factors, let me just put them on the board. Factors that would not cause one to doubt. That the watch has a maker. Okay. So you'll find these in the book on I think it's page 33 and 34. There's a set of a set of 8 Roman numerals where he lists these different points. I'm not going to speak to each of the 8 because I think some of them were more important to his argument than others, but I'm going to sample the big 4 of those 8 points that I thought were the most crucial to his overall argument. So one of these factors that would not cause a person to doubt that the watch had a maker is suppose that you've never seen a watch being made. You've never seen a watch being made. Let me explain. Me personally, speaking for myself, but probably some of you the same, haven't actually literally watched. I hate saying this thing twice, so I'm going to change the diction. You've probably not literally seen a watch being put together in a watch factory or in a workshop. Maybe you own a watch. Maybe you like watches or something, but probably unless you've taken a special interest in the topic, you have not watched the actual construction and assembly process of the watch, having seen all the pieces being carefully arranged. So, maybe some of you have actually seen a watch being made if you've had free time and you went on the internet and you looked at YouTube videos or something, how it's made, and you saw the actual process. But most of us probably haven't taken those steps. We just know that they're watches, okay? But look, even if you've not seen a watch being made, you've never seen that happen, would that make you say, wait a minute, I haven't seen it being made, so how do I know it was made by a person? Obviously, that would not create any serious reason to doubt that it did have a maker, because it's still obvious that it has all these complex parts and that it performs the function of telling time. So you don't really need to have seen it actually being made to be convinced that it has a maker. So that's one of these factors. You kind of follow me? Even if you've never seen a watch being made, that wouldn't make you deny or doubt that it had a maker. Okay, and then so here's another point on the same topic. You also would never doubt that the watch was created by someone, even if it had a flaw. So say the watch has a flaw. Say the watch is flawed, defective, maybe broken. But it's not as if seeing the watch in that condition, not working properly, busted watch, not correctly telling time, it's not like that would cause you to say, maybe it had no creator. Because, I mean, if it did, wouldn't it be perfectly well functioning? Obviously, even a broken watch still shows the same kind of evidence that it was created for the purpose of telling time, even in a case where the given watch is not properly working. So just because the watch in one possible case is not working properly, that would not cause you to say, well, this watch is broken, so maybe this one just fell out of the sky randomly and it wasn't created. Nobody would think that either. Okay, and so here's yet another point. What if you don't understand some of the aspects of how the watch works? So you don't know how it works. You don't understand or know how it works. And there again, that's not, again, any real reason to deny or doubt that it had a maker. Whether it's a watch or another example that we could just substitute it with, anything else that's got a purpose, function, and complex parts like a automobile or a computer or cell phone, unless you're like really into the technical aspects of those things, most of us probably don't exactly know how they work. I mean, can you tell somebody how a computer works? Can you tell somebody how, I mean, even a watch. This watch I'm wearing has a lot of stuff going on in there. It's got like a pulse oximeter and a heart rate monitor and, you know, all these different applications, things that you can do with it, track your running, got a GPS and stuff. But I don't know how it really works. I mean, I like the functions that it does have, and it's a nice watch, but I don't know how it works. So same with you probably in a lot of cases. You have these items, you don't really know how they work, but you know that they must have had a creator. Nobody thinks, until I know how it works, I'm not going to assume that it has a creator. You know it had an intelligent creator, despite not perhaps understanding all the aspects of how it works. Not knowing what's going on under the hood of the car, like with the engine and stuff. Still, you know that the car had to have had an intelligent creator just because of the fact that it functions the way that it does with all these parts inside. And then one more thing is that nobody would think that instead of it having a creator, it just happened through random chance events in nature. So nobody would say that the watch was caused by random chance events. So nobody would see a watch or anything similar to it with, you know, this kind of purpose and function and complexity. Nobody would see such a thing and think, well, instead of it having a maker, maybe it just fell into place through just chance events that had no intelligent guidance behind them. Okay, so like he mentioned these points just on the side because where he's leading the argument to is an analogy. He's ultimately going to say that the watch, which we know already has to have a creator for the reasons that we mentioned because of its complexity and its function. If we say this of the watch, then we have to say the same thing of the aspects of nature that also exhibit purpose, function, and complexity. And when we switch the example to nature, when we get to that side of the analogy, right, somebody he anticipates might try to push back on his conclusion by mentioning these things. Like, hey, in nature, we've never actually seen a supernatural divine being creating the works of nature, so I haven't seen it with my own eyes, the act of creation. Or you might say sometimes aspects of nature are flawed. Like sometimes people are born blind, or sometimes people have congenital birth defects, and so the normally functioning body part, whether it's the eye or the ear or something, it's not always in working order. Does this cause doubt that it have a maker? He would say no. You already said no in the case of the watch. And then suppose you don't know how some of the things that are functional and complex in nature, how they work. I mean, nowadays we know how photosynthesis works, but maybe at some time people didn't really know how plants are converting sunlight and water and stuff into energy. Or even today, the brain. I mean, there's a lot about the brain that's not currently understood. But even if you're not 100% clear on how these things work that are natural things, again, he would argue that's not a significant reason to doubt that they have to have a maker. And finally, in line with his example of the watch, he would claim that it's impossible for these things to have just been caused by randomness any more than a car, watch, computer, or something could have been caused by just random events. So finally, then, at the last part of his essay, he drops this analogy on us. And so he starts to talk about the eye, okay? So the eye is his chosen comparison with the watch. And he says, here's the similar common theme between the two. The eye, like, the eye that you can see with, it has vision. It's similar to the watch in the sense that it also has this function and purpose, the purpose of sight. And the complexity of the biological components and their internal assembly is also extremely complicated and sophisticated, right? So he thinks that if the watch had to have a creator because it was complex and functional, then we must say the same of things in nature that are complex and functional, like your eyes or ears or nose or the wings of the bird or the photosynthetic process, or on and on and on. So that's really his conclusion, that it's kind of an analogy. If you know analogies, we say like A is to B as C is to D or something like that. So in this case, it would be that the watch stands in relation to the watchmaker as the complex things in nature stand to the creator, God. Who's the watchmaker of nature? Who's the counterpart of the watchmaker in the literal case of a watch? Well, this would have to be something capable of designing the works of nature from outside of the system, and that would have to be some supernatural being. That would be like the creator God. And here's what he says about it, and so we can close this discussion with his words. He says, every indication of design which exists in the watch exists in the works of nature, and with the difference that on the side of nature, it's greater and more, and in a degree which exceeds all computation. I mean that the design of nature surpasses the design of art, what man makes, in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of the mechanism, and still more, if possible, do they go beyond them in number and variety. And they are not less evidently mechanical, not less evidently contrived, not less evidently suited to their purpose than the most perfect productions of human ingenuity. I know of no better method of introducing so large a subject than that of comparing a single thing with a single thing. An eye, for example, with a telescope. As far as the examination of the instrument goes, there's precisely the same proof that the eye was made for vision as there is that the telescope was made to assist vision. They're made upon the same principles, both being adjusted to the laws by which the transmission and reflection of light rays are regulated. And so he goes into a little bit of the basic physiology of the eye, and he says, how could such a thing, which performs this amazing function of vision due to the complex inner workings of the biological components of the eye, how could that have happened without an intelligent force like an architect guiding the construction and design of it? So there you have one more argument for the existence of God. Now we've added to our growing list of arguments and ideas, the argument from design. Now we've learned 3, ontological, cosmological, design argument. They're all a little different, but they all, of course, in common are trying to prove in their own different way that God exists. One based on God's definition, one based on the existence of the universe and the related question, how could it come to have been caused? And now the design argument, which relies mostly on the idea that there's complex functional things in nature that would have to be explained in a way similar to the inventions of man that exhibit similar type of complexity, except, of course, he says less complexity and less impressive construction than even the works of nature. Okay, so then we're done with Paley for the moment, and we are going on through the notes of our class and in the order of readings listed in the calendar. The next author is this man, and his name is Ernest Nagel. Okay, so Ernest Nagel is an American philosopher of the 20th century. He lived from 1901 until 1985. He was originally born in Czech Republic, but he immigrated to the United States as a child. So basically, American citizen from the 20th century, and he taught at Columbia University. He also attended graduate school at Columbia. So he's a real kind of legend of their department, a person who spent so much time there from his youth as a graduate student and then a full career as a professor of philosophy. He was an atheist, and that means, of course, he didn't believe in God. So he was not convinced by all the different arguments that have been provided to try and prove that God exists. And in 1959, he wrote a book which is called Does God Exist? Well, to be honest, it's called Philosophical Concepts of Atheism, but in our textbook, they've just removed one section of it and retitled it as Does God Exist? So that's what we're going to now jump into. The writing of Ernest Nagel, 20th century philosopher, and his piece from 1959, Does God Exist? So, I mean, obviously to this man, the answer is no. He doesn't believe that God exists. But what he does in the paper is he tries to just take on the biggest arguments for God's existence and provide criticism and objection. So he does go over the big three, I guess we've called it, the cosmological, ontological, and design arguments. And then he also briefly discusses a couple of other less prominent arguments for God's existence, which he tries to set aside. And then finally, in the end, closes with his own argument toward the non-existence of God. Well, it's not necessarily his argument, but he discusses an argument for the non-existence of God. So let's just go over all the things he talks about. The first thing he does is he gives his problems and criticisms with the cosmological argument. So I'm going to just, well, what I'll do first is let me read for you his summary of the cosmological argument, and then we'll launch into his objections there. He starts the discussion of it by saying this. One of the oldest intellectual defenses of theism is the cosmological argument, also known as the argument from the first cause. Briefly put, the argument goes as follows. Every event must have a cause. So, an event A, say this is the event A, must have as cause some event B. So suppose this is an arrow of causation pointing from the cause to the effect. So if we have an event A, it must have some cause B. Like this could be you, and B would be like your parents conceiving you. But B must in turn have a cause C. And so on. But if there's no end to this backwards sequence of causes, this is just an infinity symbol. If it just goes back and back forever and we never get to an initial cause, then the sequence would be infinite. And in the opinion of those who make the argument, an infinite series of events is absurd and impossible. So there must be a first cause, and the first cause is God, the initiator of all the change in the universe. So that's his kind of quick, rough summary of the cosmological argument. Some details not included, like the difference between contingent and necessary, but the basics are there. So having said the argument, he then provides his criticisms, and here I'll just create the header that says problems with the cosmological argument. Okay, so the first issue is he questions, is it really so obvious and clear that everything has to have a cause? That's one of the key premises of the argument. Everything has to have a cause, so the universe has to have one. So it has to be something that's outside the universe, different from it, not dependent on anything, and that would be God. But we could say, wait, stop right there. Who says everything has to have a cause? Is that necessarily obvious? So one question could be, does everything really have to have a cause? Okay, you might think that, okay, sure, most things have to have a cause, but maybe not the entire totality of space and time. Like maybe me or you, the sun, the moon, Eiffel Tower, Statue of Liberty, White House, some specific particular things have to have a cause. But you might deny this of the whole universe itself and just say it ultimately exists without a cause. There are perhaps isolated examples of things that appear to not behave in the typical cause-effect manner at the quantum level anyway, so maybe not everything has to have a cause. But suppose that we allow the point. Everything does have to have a cause. Well, even if everything has to have a cause, a person might argue that it's inconsistent to then right away say, but not God, though. So if everything has to have a cause, the next problem is, why doesn't God have to have a cause? Okay, so I'll put that here. If everything has to have a cause, like the argument suggests, including the whole universe, then why wouldn't God have to have a cause too? It seems inconsistent to some people to say these two things. On the one hand, everything has a cause, but on the other hand, God does not have a cause. If everything has a cause, isn't God one of the things that's part of everything? So which one is it? Is it everything has a cause, or no, at least one thing, God doesn't have one? The argument seems to want to have it both ways, but that's somewhat tense. That's like a tension between the two claims. Well, another point that follows from this is, well, suppose God does not have to have a cause. Well, if we concede that God doesn't have to have a cause, and there could be an uncaused necessary being, then why couldn't the universe itself simply be the uncaused being lacking a cause? So I'll continue the list up here, so I have a little more room. Up here, another problem with the cosmological argument. If there can be something with no cause, like God, for example, then why not just suppose the universe itself has no cause? Okay, and then finally, one more issue here. And this, I think, is quite an interesting point. He says at the end, another objection can be that, is it really true that an infinite regress is impossible? Keep in mind that in the cosmological argument, it says that there couldn't be an infinity of contingent causes because that actually infinite series is absurd and makes no sense. But now we have Nagel saying, why though? Why isn't it possible for there to be an infinity of causes with no origin? The concept of infinity is actually something we can comprehend in some ways from the studies that we have in geometry, math, and other fields of that kind. So is an infinite regress really impossible? Maybe not. I'm putting this kind of as a rhetorical question, but you can understand what the possible answers to these questions in his judgment would be. Is an infinite regress really impossible? Let me go into a little further comment on the current point here. So how could there be an infinity of events leading to the current event? Well, one way to think about it is on the analogy with mathematics and geometry. So consider, for example, the density of the number line. Take these two values on the number line, 0 and 1. Is there a value that is intermediate between the two? Yeah, it's 0.5. So new question. Is there a value on the number line which is intermediate between 0 and 0.5? And again, of course, you know the answer is yes, and it's 0.25. And now think about this as a pattern. How many times could I ask for a new value between the number 0 and the other value mentioned, which was intermediate between 0 and the other higher number? We could do this to infinity, right? 0.5, 0.25, 0.125, and on and on and on. And you would never exhaust the range of possible values because you could simply expand the decimal position and subdivide by 2. And what that shows you is that even between two very close positions on the overall natural number line, like 0 and 1, there are just as many members in between any 2 points on the number line as there are in the entire natural number series. So that's like one way of thinking about actual infinity, to have a system where a subset of the system has just as many members as the whole thing. So the question then is, why couldn't the timeline of universe history be infinitely dense like these number lines are? Maybe that's possible. Here's another example while we're on the subject. take geometry. Suppose that I show you this little line segment here that goes from point A to point B. And let's call that the line segment AB. Well, is there a midpoint between the two on this segment? Yeah, that's M. And is there a midpoint between the line segment AM? Yes, let's call it M prime. And we could continue to do this to infinity, because as you guys know, the dimensions of an individual point in geometry don't exist. It's extensionless. So you'll never exhaust the ability to gain another point which is in between the two mentioned here. And there again, we think of the infinite linear density of the geometric line. So could it be that the timeline of the history of the universe also cannot possibly be exhausted? No matter how far back you go, there will always be another member. I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but what he's claiming is that it's at least a workable concept, and therefore we don't have to agree that an infinite regress is literally impossible. It's something that maybe is possible. Okay, now I'll read his words, and you can see him put this, these points in his essay. So on the cosmological argument, he says this is an ancient argument. It's impressed many generations, but it's nonetheless weak. Let me set aside the question whether every event has a cause. Right? So he starts off kind of questioning it, but he says, I'll grant the point. Even if we assume that, he says, it's surely inconsistent to assume a first cause as a way of getting out of an infinite regress. Because if everything has to have a cause, why doesn't God have to have one? The standard answer is that he doesn't need one because he is self-caused. But if God could be self-caused, why couldn't the universe be self-caused? That was the point that we had at the top before I erased it here. And then he says, on the other hand, the supposed absurdity of an infinite regress will not be admitted by anyone who is familiar with the modern mathematical analysis of infinity. And that's this point. So therefore, he says the cosmological argument doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And that's how he closes his discussion of it. Okay, so I told you guys I think cosmological argument is one of the best ones, but it's fair enough to say there's criticisms, and he's mentioned, I think, probably the big ones that people talk about. After that, the next thing he discusses are his objections with the ontological argument. And we spent so much time on the different authors that object to that I don't want to kind of spend too much more on this. Also, his objection to it is really no different than the one by G.E. Moore. If you remember, G.E. Moore said that existence is not a predicate, and that was his point of critique against Anselm's argument. So really, Nagel says the same thing. Existence is not a predicate. But he uses an interesting, different example to make that point. So I'll tell you about his example here. He says, take the case of a $100 bill. And I think you guys know, like in our monetary system, these are the Benjamin Franklin big blue-faced $100 bills. So I don't know whether you have such a banknote with you or not. But whether you do or don't, wouldn't you agree that the definition of that unit of currency does not change whether you have it in your possession or not? So like if I come into a $100 bill and I get one, the definition of a $100 bill doesn't change depending on that fact. Whether I have it, whether I don't have it. In other words, whether it exists in a given place and time or doesn't is a separate question from what the definition of it is. So that's one way to think about how existence is not a predicate, because it doesn't add or take anything away from a description of something. I like his example, but it's a little awkward. And let me give you one that I kind of came up with that's along the same lines, but I think it's maybe clearer. Take dinosaurs, okay? You guys have heard of dinosaurs. You know what the definition of that species is. Well, today they're extinct, so they don't exist. But suppose that tomorrow, you know, like Jurassic Park, we regenerate these dinosaurs using fossilized DNA or something. Well, then when they come back into the universe and exist again, they're still the same definition, you see? So throughout all these changes, they exist, then they're extinct, then they exist again. The definition of them doesn't change. So existence is not at all one of the qualities that you would refer to in a thing's definition. The definition is what it is, regardless of whether it actually exists at that time or not. Different ways, I guess, to make the point again, that existence you wouldn't think of as a quality or an attribute of something. And if it isn't, then once again, that could be seen as a point of rejecting the ontological argument, because it seems to say that if a being is really great and as great as could possibly be, then it couldn't lack for the attribute of existence. Okay, so then from there, his next discussion has to do with the design argument that we just wrapped up at the beginning of today's meeting. So he does have some criticism of the design argument, and here's what it is. Problems with the argument from design. Okay, problems with the argument from design. He really has like two main criticisms here. The first one is that, okay, so he kind of is attacking the analogy that Paley made between the watch and the eye. If you guys think back to William Paley's discussion, he said that they're similar in the sense that although one is man-made and one is a natural thing, they both have this kind of complex function and all of these intricate parts, and so therefore there had to be an intelligent creator of both. And he says this is not a good analogy. For you to have a good, strong analogy, the things being compared have to have relevant similarities, and the similarities should be explained in a similar way. But he believes the analogy breaks down when you consider a few things. Number one, the real reason he argues that we know that the watch has a maker is not at all because it has a function. True, the watch has a function, but the real reason that we know it has a maker with such total certainty is for a much more basic and boring reason, and that is just because we human beings literally are the watch makers. So of course we're in a position to say that that thing has a maker and an architect, because it's us. We're the humans that do so. So that's one problem. The real reason that we know that the watch has a maker is not because it has a function or this internal complexity, whatever, but because we, human beings, make the watches ourselves. Okay, and then to further weaken the analogy, he says, if we slide over to the other side of the analogy, the eye, that it's being compared with the watch, yes, the eye, the presence of that function of the eye, its purpose, its complexity, that can be explained by a better supported alternative hypothesis that doesn't make mention at all of an intelligent designer. And what do you think he's talking about there, guys, in the chat, when he says that there's a different and maybe better way to explain the existence of function in the world of nature? What could possibly be the non-supernatural explanation of things in nature establishing some kind of function or purpose that allows them to thrive within their environment? What do you think I'm gesturing or hinting at here? Because that's what he's talking about. He says, when you look at nature, sure, there are things with a function, but you don't really have to assume that there's a creator to create it. It could just be based on this, what theory or idea am I talking about? That's a question for you. Just let me know. Evolution, correct. Yeah. So in nature, Darwin's theory of evolution can be given as the real explanation for how things have developed these purposive and functional adaptations. And according to that idea, it's just natural selection that causes these things to develop, not any kind of intentional act of a divine being. So, I mean, you guys have probably studied at least the basics of evolution in your biology classes in high school or even now, but the basic idea is that given a set of beings, and some with like random different mutations and stuff, some of them having those are going to then be more well-equipped for survival in their environment. And the ones that have such adaptations will pass them on to the next generation more effectively because they'll more successfully mate and reproduce. So those traits then become naturally selected for because there's greater degree of survival in beings that possess those traits. And the ones that don't have them are naturally just kind of weeded out through the process of natural selection. They don't survive in as many numbers. And therefore, over the long scale of geologic time scales, things like the eyes and ears and wings of birds and etc. develop very slowly. So, I mean, that's another possible explanation for the function seen in nature. So I'm going to erase the top here so I can put this as the second problem. The purpose or function of the eye, and it's not just the eye, but etc., can be explained without assuming a maker via evolution. Okay, so then I'll read his discussion here on this point. He says, so he summarizes the argument first. He says, oh, if we find a watch in some deserted spot, we don't think it came into existence by chance, and we don't hesitate to conclude that an intelligent creature designed and made it. But the world and all its contents exhibit mechanisms and mutual adjustments that are also complicated and even more subtle than the watch. Do we have to conclude that these are also made by a creator? He says, the conclusion of the argument is based on an inference from analogy. The watch and the world are alike in possessing a congruence of parts and an adjustment of means to an end. The watch has a watchmaker, so the world has a world maker. But is this really a good analogy? Let's set aside some important issues, in particular the issue whether the universe is the unified system that the watch is. That's one thing he's mentioning there also. He's saying that how can we compare the whole universe with the watch? If you look at the whole universe, there's lots of stuff in it that doesn't seem to really exhibit much purpose or function. Like, what's a black hole really doing? It's just sucking in matter and even light, not doing anything for anybody. So if we focus our attention on a couple little items on the surface of the earth, the eyes and ears and stuff of these living organisms, then we're narrowing our focus to just a small part of the big universe. But he says, setting that aside, let me concentrate on the question, why are we so sure that the watch could not come about except through an intelligent manufacturer? The answer is plain. We've never run across a watch that was not made by someone. But the situation is not like this in case of the systems with which we're familiar in nature. Even in the case of living organisms, though they're generated by their parents, the parents don't make them in the same sense that watchmakers do. But he says, moreover, the argument loses all its force if the facts which the hypothesis of a creator is supposed to explain can be understood on the basis of a better supported assumption. And indeed, such an alternative explanation is one of the achievements of Darwin biology. For Darwin showed that you can account for the variety of biological species, as well as for their adaptations to their environment, without invoking a divine creator and acts of special creation. And then he goes into a little bit of brief discussion as to how the theory of evolution says that things acquire a function. So much then for the design argument. That's another critique given by Ernest Nagel. After that, in his paper, he basically turns his attention to two other, I guess we could call them miscellaneous arguments for God's existence, because these are some additional arguments that try to make the case that God exists, but I think they've achieved a little less prominence in the literature than some of these others that we've already talked about. But nonetheless, they're important arguments, and he wants to briefly mention them and also try to show why he finds fault with them too. So let me just create the heading that says like two miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. These is kind of like in the grab bag of arguments and his critique of them. So one of them, we could call it the argument from unfairness. I don't know if I can come up with a better name for it. So let's just go with this label. The argument from unfairness. Okay. Now, basically, the gist of the argument is this, that if God did not exist, suppose God didn't exist. If he didn't exist, then the universe we are in would just be too unfair, and that cannot be, so there must be a God, okay? Then in that case, the world would be too unfair. So therefore, God must exist. Okay, now let me try and persuade you of the idea of the argument a little bit. Well, I'll get into it with some questions. Now, let me know what you think. Do bad things ever happen to good people in this world? Does that ever happen that, sometimes good people done nothing wrong, didn't deserve it at all, but something horrible happened to them? So does that ever happen? Bad things happening to good people? Sure it does. Yes, Alex. It's a sad thing. We would hope that never does happen, but unfortunately, yes. And, the examples abound. It'd be almost too obvious to mention, but, you've heard about little children getting shot up at schools, and you've heard about people getting raped, and there was the Holocaust, and all kinds of even other things, natural disasters that take people's lives in the prime of their life, and disease striking people down, like with COVID, separating families. So there's a lot of terrible things that happen in the world that have happened and continue to happen at times. So bad things can happen to good people. Here's another question. Do good things ever happen to bad people? Do sometimes bad people enjoy the best things that life has to offer without any accountability? And is that another possibility? So one case we just mentioned was bad things happening to good people. But can't it also be that in some cases good things happen to bad people and they never ever face any kind of penalty, punishment, or loss? Sure. And it's sad and it's disturbing to think of those cases, but there have been serial killers and stuff that were never caught, like the Zodiac killer, and some of those people said that they liked what they were doing, as disgusting as that is. And so, you can imagine some people went to their grave never having faced a day in court or any kind of guilt or shame. And so some bad people, enjoy what they're doing in life, and it could even be more extreme. Like some bad people become wealthy and rich. And, I don't know, like people talked about Epstein and all that stuff, right? But I guess he ultimately died in prison. Anyway, point taken, right? Bad things can happen to good people. Good things can happen to bad people. So if there's a God, then what could God do to sort of balance these scales of justice? To the person who lived a good moral life and did everything they should do, but they suffered some of the worst pain and suffering life could give, what could God do to right these wrongs and provide a measure of justice? If God exists, then it's okay in a weird way that a person who lived a good life suffered, because then in that case, what would happen? What could God provide or do for those good people who were made to suffer in their life? He could give them heaven. That's correct. He could give them the divine reward in the afterlife, of the heavenly afterlife. So that would make it fair in the end, that even if it appears that good people can suffer, there would ultimately be their divine reward. And at the same time, on the other hand, if God exists and there are bad people doing terrible things, getting away with it and not feeling bad at all, living their best life, whatever, then if there's a God, you imagine that he could at least deny this person of heaven, or even send them to hell or to purgatory. So if there's a God, you figure he could dispense justice in the afterlife, give people their just deserts. If they deserved penalty for their bad record of moral behavior, then they would get the punishment. And if they deserved a reward for it, then they would get the reward. But if there's no God, the argument is saying, right, then the good person that suffered just goes to their grave and they never get rewarded. And the bad person that prospered and thrived, they go to their grave and they never suffer any penalty, and that's the end of it. So if there's no God, then the universe might be hopelessly unfair, because there's no method to right the wrongs or to penalize the wrongdoers. So that just can't be. That can't be the case. Therefore, there has to be a God. That's the argument. Now, he only mentions this briefly because I think he judges it to be a weaker argument and it's easy to criticize. I figure maybe even some of you could think through what the criticism might be. Like, put yourself in the mind state of an opponent of this argument, like Nagel. What do you think somebody like that could say if they feel that this doesn't really prove that God exists? Is there anything that could be said back to this, like, but that's not really proving that God exists? What would be the reason, if any, that this fails to persuade or convince a skeptic? Let me know if you have any thoughts on that at all. Like, or do you think that that's just that argument is just bulletproof and can't be defeated. It makes the case. Okay, yeah, so Ellie, correct. You're getting to the core objection. The argument is based around an assumption that the universe must be fair, and only God's existence could guarantee or secure that. But if you don't hold this baseline assumption that the universe or that life is fair, then the argument would fall apart. And in fact, it's to me almost a little annoying, because the common truism that you hear from your youth on up is that, hey, life isn't fair. You know, you've heard maybe parents and advisors and stuff saying that to you. Life isn't fair, so you toughen up, just get used to it. You know, if you expect it to be fair, you're going to be disappointed. So that even seems to be almost like the going opinion of most people, that life isn't fair. And this argument is running contrary to that, saying that it actually is fair and God's existence is what guarantees that it is. So in his view, the author Nagel, he says it sounds more like a projection of hopes than something that's based on proof and evidence. Sure, it would be what we hope, that this is a fair place, this universe, and that people get their rewards or punishments according to their record of deeds. But just because that would be fair if it's the case doesn't establish that it's actually true. And so he says assumption, it's just an argument based on an assumption, but it's an assumption that's not proven. Okay, and so one more little brief, I say 2 miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. We just now dealt with one of the 2. One more is, well, we're coming close to the tail end of our class time, and so I know that, but maybe I can at least mention this one, and then we'll wrap it up when we return on Monday. The other one is the argument from religious experience. Now, this is another common argument for God's existence, but it's not based really on like a logical argument. Well, it is an argument, but it's based more on an experience that people have, okay? So a person who follows this argument as their basis for believing God would say that the reason they believe in God is because they had a powerful religious experience that made the existence of God just apparent to them. So one claims that based on a religious experience they had, that they know God exists. Okay, so we won't be able to finish all the discussion of this just right now, but let me at least set you up with some thoughts on the idea. A religious experience, sometimes they're called mystical experiences, but I prefer the label religious because mystical sometimes carries connotations of like Eastern religious traditions and meditation, whatever, but in general, religious experiences are like these powerful moments in a person's life that some people will claim where in that moment, whatever it was, the reality of God became clear to the person. Like maybe the presence of God they felt was revealed to them in this moment. Maybe you guys have some ideas of what these experiences include. They could be like a brush with death that you survived, or it could be the fulfillment of a prayer in some kind of auspicious way. It could be, I don't know, you were just sitting atop a mountain, like praying or reading or meditating on the concept of God, and all of a sudden you had this transcendent moment where you felt like connected to the world and to God, and somehow that made it seem to you very clear that there's a God. So religious experience, we can't too narrowly define it because it takes a variety of forms. But what they all have in common is that in the midst of that powerful and vivid event, someone comes away saying, now I know there's a God. I had a religious experience. God, touched me, and I felt like now I can see. But we're going to hear how Nagel finds that this is actually not a very good way of trying to make an argument or proof to a skeptic. So we'll get to that next time, and we'll finish this. Nagel is pretty much only a few little notes left, and then we'll be able to catch up with Pascal and Clifford on Monday. So just keep reading through those lectures that you see listed in the syllabus, and I'll be working on distributing the prompt for the first essay, and we'll talk about that next week on Monday as well. So thanks everybody again. Have a good weekend. I know we don't get a long weekend for President's Day, but anyway, happy holidays, I guess, and I'll see you back then. So take it easy, and if you need anything, let me know. Also, I sent off the link to the office hours just in case. Probably no one needs to come if they don't want, but if you do, I'll be there from 11 to 12. Okay, guys, well, have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.